Dr. Bhaskaran, the Chinese Communist Party isn't just exporting minerals, it's exporting leverage. By controlling the midstream choke points of global mineral processing and using that power to restrict exports of rare earth elements, Beijing is effectively turning raw materials into raw geopolitical pressure. America can't afford, in my estimation, to respond with vague policies or blanket tariffs. That's why I've introduced a strategic three-part legislative approach: the Finding Ore Act, the Critical Minerals Security Act, and the Strategic Minerals Act, to map global resources with a right of first refusal, to monitor supply chain risks, and to forge sector-specific free trade agreements with trusted partners. Even if we streamline permitting tomorrow, Dr. Bhaskaran, which is a much-needed priority, we'd still need international partnerships because the U.S. simply doesn't have every mineral under our feet. Dr. Bhaskaran, given these realities, do you believe this sector-specific approach in my Strategic Minerals Act is the right path to secure long-term supply?
Thank you, Senator. I think the sector-specific trade agreements are absolutely critical, and I want to commend you on a lot of the great work you've been doing. When we start back and think about exploration, identifying new deposits are absolutely critical, and ensuring those stay in allied hands is really important. One of the reasons China has excelled is they have taken the whole supply chain from exploration, mapping, exploration, production, and processing. For the U.S. to come in and excel, it needs to start at that early stage. I think that's important. Second, sector-specific trade agreements are important. As was earlier noted, it's not really the flavor of the decade to go to a free trade agreement as a whole, right. But we need to ensure that we are being targeted with our trade policies to our long-term vulnerabilities, because we see that China continues to weaponize them. The list just keeps getting longer. So absolutely, it's going to be many of the tools that you've highlighted.
Great, thank you. Too often it seems, Dr. Bhaskaran, that the conversation around critical minerals ends at the mine. Certainly many of our conversations here in Congress, and understandably so, many of our constituents are excited about accessing domestic minerals on account of the jobs it creates, and it just seems intuitively to make a lot of sense. But without refining, there is no supply chain, there is no value chain, and there is no utility for these rocks and other minerals we get out of the ground. The U.S. has made meaningful progress in growing domestic midstream capacity, but China still dominates globally, manufacturing over 90% of rare earths and graphite processing. That kind of concentration isn't just risky. It gives Beijing outsized influence over the global industrial base. Our allies, like Japan, have taken a more strategic approach, pairing public financing with enforceable offtake agreements to secure mineral access and build processing capacity abroad, locking in supply while supporting its industrial base. Dr. Bhaskaran, in your written testimony, you referenced Japan as a successful model. Could you expand on how a similar approach might work for the United States and what you see as the most important steps Congress can take to develop midstream processing capacity without simply shifting the bottlenecks?
Thanks so much, Senator. You know, one of the things that made Japan so successful is where they use state funding, there's an offtake requirement that must go to Japanese companies. What we don't want to do in the United States is use DFC and use EXIM, both of which are up for reauthorization in 2025 and 2026, to fund projects that ultimately get signed over to Chinese processing. We've already seen it with Serra Verde, which has been shortlisted as a heavy rare earths project by the U.S.-led Mineral Security Partnership, that in the New York Times recently came out that they've signed their long-term offtake agreement over to China. That is actually quite self-defeating for our use of taxpayer resources. What we want to do is ensure that where we're using government financing, it's aligned, a percentage of it is coming back either through guaranteed offtake or discounted offtake to U.S. companies. This is how we start to take the mine-to-market supply chain. So aligning our financing with our offtake agreements.
For a question.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, well, thank you, and I'll make it highly abbreviated because the good Senator Wyden basically laid a predicate for my question of Mr. Whitaker, and this might be a harmonious moment of bipartisan interest in the med device industry so that we can explore together, Senator Wyden, how to optimize our trade enforcement tools for an industry that is really important to my state and to the health and well-being of so many Americans, but also highly regulated and life critical. So I guess, Mr. Whitaker, are there particular things that we should be thinking about as policymakers to take into account the life critical and highly regulated nature of your industry when designing or considering trade enforcement tools?
Right. So first of all, I would answer it this way. Broad tariff policy is not constructive relative to that. Targeted tariff policy, as many of our colleagues have said, could be constructive relative to certain component parts. But I would put it in three broad categories from a broad policy standpoint. Tax policy matters a lot relative to manufacturing in the United States. A low corporate tax rate, appropriate incentives, R&D incentives in the tax code matter a lot in order to relocate our products here and continue to build here. Secondly, regulatory policy matters. Regulations are important, but if they're not expedited and it's a slow process, it's very difficult for us. And third, reimbursement policy matters as well. Other countries are very careful about reimbursing products that are built in their country for their country at a rate that's better than ours.
I see.
We don't do that in our country, and we need to. And I'll give you one more thing. The breakthrough legislation that you've introduced for medical technologies will make a huge difference in U.S.-made manufacturing products coming to market more quickly. It incentivizes growth, it incentivizes jobs, and it's good for the healthcare system.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.